Hi, my name is Bob Picard. I'm an alcoholic. You'll have to forgive the voice. I'm coming off a real bad cold here. No, I wasn't coming off one of them, David. But we're not going to lose it because my wife just informed me that she's picking it up. So we brought it down here with us, and we'll take it back with us. I'd like to mind my manners and thank you for allowing me to participate in your conference. We've had a great time since we've been here, met some wonderful people, and heard some great messages. You know, everybody's got a part in these things. Everybody has a function that they're supposed to do. And if you've were at the meeting last night or the meeting so far today, you've heard some outstanding talks. And at these deals, there's always one speaker who somehow or another just isn't with it and kind of gets up and gives a lousy talk. So I guess that's my job today. Hopefully we can be able to fulfill that. I'd like to thank Brenda and Brad. Brenda called me a year or so ago and asked me to participate in this, and she said that she was looking forward to seeing us here, and we were looking forward to meeting her and all that. Something I didn't know. Brenda and Brad, would you stand up, please? Is there anybody else that's here on their honeymoon? And be especially nice to Brad. Now Brad's not an alcoholic. And as of yet, he's not an Al-Anon. And this is the first deal like this he's ever been to. And if I'd have been in his shoes, I'd have probably left a long time before now, you know. So if he ain't confused by now, damn it, he sure will be in a short period down the road. So if you get an opportunity to talk to Brad, don't tell him what it's going to be like. He'll find out for himself. I had an opportunity here a couple weeks ago to stand up in front of a bunch of professionals in the community and do a public information talk up in northern Minnesota, and we were talking about some of the things that we don't do, you know, that we don't sponsor research or engage in any of that type of thing. We don't try to prevent alcoholism, you know. We don't try to educate people about alcoholism. We don't know anything about any of that kind of stuff. But I think sometimes, you know, if we're looking around and paying attention, we can kind of see it coming, you know. And there's a story I know that illustrates that, and it's about a guy that made a telephone call, and a little boy answered, and the little boy said, "Hello," and the guy says, "Is your mother there?" And the kid says, "She's busy." He said, "Well, anybody else there?" He says, "My dad." He said, "Well, let me talk to your dad." He says, "He's busy too." He said, "Anybody else there?" He says, "The police." He said, "Well, let me talk to one of the policemen." He says, "They're all busy too." He says, "Well, who else is there?" He says, "Firemen." He says, "Well, let me talk to one of the firemen." He says, "They're all busy too." He says, "Well, what are all these people doing?" He says, "They're looking for me." Now, you just know in about 3 or 4 years when he starts adding some liquid to that personality that we're going to have him up here as a speaker one of these days. And that's kind of the way we do it. We've got 4 children and a whole bunch of grandchildren. And, you know, all 4 kids became alcoholics. 3 of them are sober today. One of them's still out there. But you look at the grandchildren. Well, you can see it coming. I mean, it's heading our way. And I really, you know, people say, God, I hope my kids, you know, I hope the kids manage to avert it. I don't. I hope to hell they get started as early as possible. I really do. I want every one of my grandchildren to become an alcoholic. I really do. Because that's what's necessary to become a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I happen to think that we live better than any people on earth. I really do. I'm a member of the 1609 group in Superior, Wisconsin, which allows me, I think, at this meeting to be the only person who can legitimately stand up here and say, my name's Bob and I'm a superior alcoholic. But I hear a lot of people talking about that my group's the best group in the world. And Dave Cook talks about that. And he says, if you don't think that about your group, he says, I suggest you find another group. And I don't agree with Dave on that. And I've told him that. I think if you don't think that your group is the best group in the world, then, please don't leave it and go screw somebody else's group up. Stay there and fix what you probably helped to cause. Because if my group isn't the best group that I know of, or that we can make it, then I'm the only person that I can get to do anything about that. Maybe some other people will decide that too. But it's up to me. It's up to each of us as individuals to put into something to that group, And I think, having a home group is a vitally important thing. I watch a lot of people that just go to meetings. They go to a lot of meetings, but they're not attached to nothing. And they never seem to get too far in this program. I think that I heard a guy talking about this just a couple of weeks ago. We were at a conference, and he was talking about, you can kind of check yourself out by who you hang out with. If you're hanging out with the people that are just floating around and doing nothing, you're probably just floating around and doing nothing. If you hang out with the people that are involved in doing a lot of things, you're probably involved in doing a lot of things. If you hang out with the people that never work the steps and think it's just a bunch of BS, well, you're probably don't work the steps and think it's a bunch of BS. Or if you're hanging around with a bunch of people that are working this program, you're probably working it too. So if you want to know how you're doing, take a look around you and see who you're hanging out with. And I think generally, I know that when he said that, I started looking at the people that I hung around with in Alcoholics Anonymous. And by God, it made me feel pretty good because I hang around some people that are pretty active in this thing and do a lot of things in this program and work it pretty well. And I feel very fortunate that I was just dropped into a group of people that happen to do that. You've all probably familiar with the preamble, which is the best known description of Alcoholics Anonymous that we have. But Bill had another description of AA that I like, and he used it many, many times in many forms. But the one I like best was in a talk that he gave in Akron in 1947, and we discovered it on 378 records it was recorded on that we have in the Northern Minnesota archives. And Bill says that Alcoholics Anonymous is not the personal success story. It is rather the story of our colossal human failure, converted to the happiest kind of usefulness by that divine alchemy, the living grace of God. And so I'm not here tonight because I'm any kind of a success story. I'm not here tonight because I'm a winner. I'm here today because I'm a colossal human failure at the biggest business in the world, the business of living. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a society of winners. Winners don't come to AA. They just don't need to. They're out there winning somewhere. Losers come to Alcoholics Anonymous. And the amazing thing is that through that divine alchemy, this collection of losers can look and think and act and most importantly feel like winners if we just do the very simple things that they ask us to do once we get here. I didn't know what alchemy meant, and I looked it up, and it talks about a process through which we take something of absolute worthlessness and turn it into something of extreme value, and I think that that's what we do in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I wondered about that phrase, the living grace of God. What's the difference between the grace of God and the living grace of God? And what it is to me, the grace of God is what got me to Alcoholics Anonymous, with no participation on my part, with no help or cooperation. As a matter of fact, probably against my will. But it was the grace of God that got me to Alcoholics Anonymous. It's the living grace of God that keeps me here, and that requires my participation. What used to be my will with God's help has to become God's will with my help. And I think that's what Alcoholics Anonymous asks us to participate in. In chapter 5, it says that our stories disclose in a general way what we were like, what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. This afternoon, if I may, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I used to be like and what happened to me and what I'm trying to be like today as a result of the principles of this program. I grew up in what is described as a dysfunctional home. I grew up in an alcoholic home. And I knew it was an alcoholic home. I just learned recently it was a dysfunctional home. Now I was the only boy and we had 5 kids. I had 2 older sisters, 2 younger sisters, and I was the only boy. Which any psychiatrist or psychologist will tell you that I'm doomed to some kind of neuroticism. But it happens to everybody. You know, if you're in a home where you were the youngest child, or the oldest child, or the middle child, or if you're in a one-parent home, or or a 2-parent home where nobody loved you, or a 2-parent home where both people loved you and the other people didn't, or whatever. Basically, any of these conditions will qualify as a dysfunctional home. After researching that term, I've come to understand that I don't know anybody that wasn't raised in a dysfunctional home. I think that we belong to a feel-good society today. You're never supposed to feel disappointment or pain or any of those kind of things. And if you do, by God, we got somebody to help you, or we got something to help you. And we know a lot about that, especially we do. But I was raised in an alcoholic home, and my father was an alcoholic, and I know about alcoholic homes, and I know about the sounds of alcoholic homes. And I know about the noises and the terror, and the 4 horsemen visiting the family. The 4 horsemen of terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. And I grew up with those things. I grew up in a home that was absolutely dominated by an alcoholic. I was down in Texas at one time, and I heard this Alateen speaker down there that was talking about that she wasn't comfortable with the way things were going on in her home. So she called a family meeting where they could work that out. And it kind of brought me back to my childhood. There was my mother and my father and 5 children and 1 vote. It just didn't matter what anybody else said. My father had the only vote that counted. And nobody else's opinion was asked for or considered or even listened to. And it was kind of a confusing type thing, too. When he was sober, I didn't understand that he was an alcoholic who had mood swings, and we'd be sitting there at the supper table, and everybody'd be laughing and joking and having a good time. And all of a sudden, his mood would change. And then everybody's supposed to be quiet and serious and just finish eating. And I always missed them switches by about 20 seconds, So I was always in a little bit of turmoil there. My father was a very masculine guy. He was a fighter and a crane operator, construction worker, and a longshoreman, and heavy drinker. He's a periodic drunk. He would go 3 months without drinking and then go on a 1-month binge, and he'd go 6 months without drinking and go on a 2-month binge or 3-day binge or whatever. But it was always binges, and then he'd be done for a while. But he was a very masculine guy, and he took a lot of pride in that. And I was his only son, and I wasn't like that. He wanted a tough kid that could go out and fight and be a sports hero and all that kind of stuff. And I wasn't a fighter. I got in a lot of fights. There was generally 2 hits to all my fights. The other guy hit me, and I'd hit the ground. That was about it. I was in 1,000 fights, never won one. Got married, picked out a little 5-foot Finlander. Figured, well, hell, if we get into something, I can win one there. Never won one of them. By the way, in case I might refer to her again before this talk is over, I'd just like to introduce her. Sandy, would you stand up for a minute? Can't see her much better when she's standing up than when she's sitting down. But I was always trying to please my father and get his approval, and I could never do that. I know that the time that the first speaker that rung my bell, the first guy that I ever heard talk in Alcoholics Anonymous, that just reached inside me and grabbed a hold of me was a guy by the name of Tommy Breen out of Winnipeg, Canada. And Tommy's dead now, and great speaker. In my opinion, is the greatest speaker to ever come out of Canada. And Tommy talked about having a terrible fear of rejection and a desperate need for approval. And I knew what he was talking about because that was my life. You know, and he was talking about that fear of his father, and I knew what he was talking about because that was my life. And he was talking about finding something in a bottle of alcohol, and I knew what he was talking about because that was my life. Tommy reached inside of me, and he told my story through his experiences. And I heard him, and I identified, and I became a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, Tommy was the first guy to really reach in and grab a hold of me and let me know what this thing was about. You know, and I became a member at that meeting, really, inside. And he explained so many things that I had went through, and I could remember trying desperately to get my father's approval. And he was a construction worker, worked out of town a lot, so he always had a decent car. We lived in a real poor neighborhood in the north end of Superior, and Superior's a port city. It seems like, you know, it's in a strange place for a port city, but it's in the middle of the country. But it's tonnage wise probably about the fourth largest port in the United States for the amount of tonnage that it ships. So it's pretty good sized port. And it was when I was a kid, it was a great town. Great town. I mean, it was a wild. The north end of Superior was wild. It was a town that was known all over the Great Lakes. And I had 2 paper routes when I was a kid, and I had 8 whorehouses on my paper routes. And since then, they've all closed, but town went to hell since then. But it was a great town then. But I used to I lived in that neighborhood, that rough end of town, and I used to wash and wax my dad's car every weekend, and I'd work 8 hours on that car and get it just sparkling. And he'd come home, and he'd sit from about 50 feet away. He'd say, "A little smudge in the bumper there. You know, you missed a spot on the windshield, or whatever it might be." He'd say, "Pretty good job, but if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing well." You know, I never once, not one time, did he ever come home and say, "By God, she really looks good, Bob. Thanks a lot." It was always pretty good job, but you know, and there were some attitudes that I would carry into my adulthood, or as Franklin Williams used to say, it was attitudes that I carried into my adultery. And it was sometime I didn't, I always wanted to do something that, about growing up. And one thing that every boy has in common, virtually every boy has in common, is he wants to be a man. And it never seems to get there, and I'm still waiting for it to show up, but every boy wants to grow up and be a man. And I would hear things like, you have to learn how to drink like a man. And I would hear these men talking about their drinking escapades, the last week or the last night or the last drunk or whatever, or how much they had consumed or how drunk they had gotten or how long they had been going or whatever it might be. But in my mind, drinking was connected with manhood. And somewhere along the line, when I was about 15, I started drinking. Now, that wasn't my first drink. I had had a drink here and a drink there along the way. I don't know when I had my first one. I'm not really concerned with it, but I know I started drinking at about the age of 15. And at the beginning, it was not real successful drinking. I would drink and get sick and go to bed, and that would be it. And when I first started drinking, there was a magic number. We were drinking beer, and the magic number was a 6-pack. I had to be able to drink a 6-pack. Somebody talked about it earlier, about the 2 beers, It's an easy test for alcoholism. Ask an alcoholic at any stage of a drinking how much he had to drink. You never get a straight answer. Never get a straight answer. At the beginning, I'd ask, I'd drink 3, and they'd say, "How many do you have?" I'd say 8. 20 years later, I drink 33 and say 4. I avoided 2 because I knew that was telltale, We picked up our kid out of jail one night in the middle of the night, taking him home. I says, "How much were you drinking?" And he says, "2 beers." And I says, "You'll qualify." But it wasn't a short time after I started drinking that I discovered something. I could drink. I could drink a lot. I could drink a lot more than anybody I was hanging around with. And for some reason, as a result of that, I started hanging around with guys that were a little older, and going places and doing things that 16-year-old kid shouldn't have been doing, places he shouldn't have been going. And some of those guys are still friends of mine today, and, today I'm 54 and they're 62 or 58 or whatever, no big deal. But when I was 16 and they were 22, it was a big deal. When I was 16 and I could get into bars, just because I happened to be with a bunch of guys that were 22 and 23 and 24 years old, it was a big deal. When all my peers were asking me to go in and get them some booze, it was a big deal. When I worked in a bar in Superior, bartending at the age of 19 when you had to be 21 to get in there, it was a big deal. Those were heady experiences for a kid that had never been able to do anything right, for a kid that always felt like a misfit, for a kid that always felt less than, for a kid that had always been put down because he wasn't tough. And I was hanging out with men, and it was a big deal. And somewhere in that area, I discovered that I felt more comfortable when I drank. Now, I didn't ever consciously think that I can remember. I just know that when I drank, I had more fun. I just know that when I drank, I felt more comfortable. I just knew that drinking was some kind of a magical thing. And I felt sorry for people who hadn't discovered that. And somebody talked about it earlier that, our drinking makes sense. I think the only drinking that makes sense is alcoholic drinking. And if there's some social drinker in here that has that one or two and they're content with that, well, have at it. I don't understand why I'll tell you what you're like to me. It's like I'm going swimming. So I pack up the car and go drive down to the beach and go take my clothes off and put my swimming trunks on and walk to the edge of the water and stick my toe in and say, by God, that was refreshing, and go back and change clothes and go back home. And it makes just as much sense to me as having a drink or two. When I'm going swimming, I don't check to see if the water is warm or cold or tepid or what. I just dive in. And when I started drinking, I didn't check to see if there was going to be ramifications and jails and hurt feelings and bad relationships. I just dove in. And when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I didn't check to find out if there was going to be some work and some hard times, and some serenity and some peace and some joy. I just dove in. It's what alcoholics do. We just dive in, or at least it's what this alcoholic did, And if you listen to AAs and Al-Anons talk, you can generally, if you listen to enough talks, you can always hear that thing about that drinking thing. And the non-alcoholic drinker drinks and starts to feel it and quits. And the alcoholic drinker drinks and starts to feel it and continues. Now, the non-alcoholic, when starting to feel it, quits because they find themselves losing control. And the alcoholic drinker drinks and starts to feel it and continues because he starts gaining control. And that, I believe, is the difference between the alcoholic and a non-alcoholic drinker. Teetotalers are a strange lot that I think should be studied a hell of a lot more than they are. But I was able to do that, and everything went well. And alcohol was the best friend I ever had. Alcohol was the greatest thing that ever happened to me in my life. And I think that a lot of times I sit in these meetings and it sounds like alcohol is getting a bad name, and I want to jump up and defend it. Because I'll guarantee you, if it wasn't for alcohol, half the people in this room would be dead. Because alcohol was the thing that we used to keep us from blowing our brains out because we couldn't stand the truth of our existence. The problem of the alcoholic is not alcohol. The problem of the alcoholic is that he cannot stand sobriety. Alcohol is the solution to that for a while. for a while. But it's a solution that turns on us. And what started out to be my best friend one day turned into my worst enemy, but I never saw it coming. I never seen it happen. It's a gradual thing. It didn't, it wasn't like Tuesday alcohol was the best friend I ever had, and Wednesday it was my worst enemy. It was a thing that evolved over a long period of time, over a number of years. And it took me some time, but I had a lot of good times drinking. I hear people say, I never had a good time drinking. I thought, what the hell did they do it for? There's only one word. I've really thought about this, and there's only one word that I can come up with for somebody that spent 20 years doing something they never enjoyed. Moron. Nothing else seems to fit. Why would you do that? Why would you keep doing something you never enjoyed? Now, an alcoholic enjoyed it for a while, and then he spent the rest of the time trying to recapture that, pursuing that illusion that it talks about in the 3rd chapter of our book. Trying to recapture their feeling of freedom and peace and joy and confidence. I'd walk into a room like this sober, and I'd look around and, wonder where I should sit. Wonder who I should talk to. What should I say to them? How do you hold a conversation? What can I say to these people that'll make them like me? What can I say that'll make them think I'm an interesting guy? How do you do that? I didn't know. I take a drink of alcohol, walk into the same room, and it seemed like from every table, people were saying, hey, Bob, come on over here. Sit with us. Tell us that same old story one more time, It just seemed like people wanted to talk to me and wanted to get to know me. You see, when I first started finding out about what alcohol did to people, I thought that when I drank alcohol that I changed, And that's pretty powerful stuff. But it ain't really that big a deal. And it's not what really happens. At least it's not what happened to me. See, what happened to me was I would take a drink of alcohol and you would change. You became more friendly. You became more willing to listen. You became more willing to have me sit with you and talk to you and go out with you or whatever the case may be. If I take a drink of alcohol and we change a person, that's big, but it's nothing real huge. But if I take a drink of alcohol and we change the world, that's powerful. That's powerful. And until I got to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I never knew anything else was that powerful. And Clancy talks about this thing being a disease of perception. And my reality is what I perceive. And if I perceive you to be friendly and outgoing and gracious and all of that, that's what you are to me. And if I perceive you to be standoffish and snobbish and that's what you are to me. My reality has nothing to do with reality. My reality has to do with my perception. Alcohol alters the perception of an alcoholic. His perception of his environment without changing either him or his environment. Same situation, it's just my perception of it is different. That's caused by a drink of alcohol. And it carried through every relation I had. It carried through my jobs, my family life, everything. A drink of alcohol made it different. For a long time, it made it better. And then for a long time, it made it worse. But I had completely given myself to alcohol. I had tried a lot of different relationships. None of them worked out because I didn't know why. But I had some sort of a unwillingness to face responsibility, I guess, that I didn't know I had. So as soon as the relationship started getting serious, I'd do whatever was necessary to break it up. And I went through lots of relationships that way. And then I didn't have to live up to the responsibilities of a relationship. And one day I walked into a bar in Superior and there was a new barmaid in there, and her and I started getting something going, and she had just coming off of a divorce and she had 4 children and I was just out for some fun. And one thing led to another, and we started getting pretty serious. And Superior is a town that's populated with a whole lot of housing projects. And those housing projects are populated with a whole lot of young single women, most of them single mothers. And Superior is populated with a lot of bars. I mean, 30,000 people and 105 bars. And it's a bar town. That was what you do there. And so you go out at night and these bars are all loaded with these women. And I found out something, that if you just talk to them, I mean, you didn't have to make no sense. It didn't make any difference what you said. If you just talk to them, they'd sit and listen all night. You also had to buy drinks, but, and so I did the same thing with this girl I'd done with all the rest of them. Because I guess nobody had been talking to them for years. And this girl had been married to somebody that didn't talk to her, and so I came in and was yakking, nonstop, and she loved it, I thought, or whatever. Which, relationship started moving along. And I came in one day and she said something to me in a way that I can't really explain to you, but basically the gist of it was that she told me I was the biggest phony that she'd ever met. I'd like to explain how that happened or what she said, but I came into a meeting one day after I got in Alcoholics Anonymous. My sponsor called me over, and he says, "Hey, Bob," he says, "what was that Johnny Harris said about cursing at your conference?" And I thought for a while, and I was right at that stage of sobriety where my sponsor was quoting things to me. He never asked me to quote something to him. So when he asked me to quote something to him, I thought, by God, I'm coming along in this deal, And I thought for a minute, and I says, well, Johnny says that cursing is a crutch for conversational cripples. And he says, yeah, that's it. He says, why don't you go home and think about that for a while? And so because of that, I've tried to clean up my talk a little bit, and I can't use the words that she used when she told me I was the biggest phony that she had ever met. But she hit something inside of me that hurt, and she hit that ungrounded fear of the alcoholic that somehow, somewhere, some way, someone is going to find out all about you, see you for exactly what you are, remove all the facades and the veils and the masks and everything, and see you for the insignificant little shit that you are. And she's seen through me and seen that, and it hurt. It hurt, and I knew I had to do something. I had to do something to get even with that person. Get revenge, Don't get mad, get even, get revenge. 12 and 12 talks about revenge. It talks about beating ourselves with the club of anger that we'd intended for another. And I thought, well, I got to hurt her the way she hurt me, and what can I do to do that? And I thought about it, and then I did it, and I married her. And I walked into a house with 4 beautiful young children in it. I didn't know anything about being a father. The only thing I knew about being a father was the way I was raised. And I came into that house like a stormtrooper. I'd come home from work and I'd see that a little boy had mowed a great big lawn, and I wouldn't see that. I'd say, you missed a little spot over there by a tree. If the job's worth doing, it's worth doing well. Pretty good job, but I took all the things that I hated about my father, and I brought it into that household, and I added some things. And in 3 very short years, those kids came to hate me at a very deep level, justifiably so. In those 3 years, Sandy and I went through all kinds of hellacious living. I had 2 divorce papers served on me, and the third one was sitting on the lawyer's desk on the day of our 3rd wedding anniversary, June the 18th of 1976. And we went out for one more time to try to put this thing together. And that's the last day that either one of us drank. Sandy had been going to AA meetings for a little bit before that. She'd started in January. She had been 12-stepped by 8 members of the Superior Police Department. And she refused to go to treatment, so they strongly suggested that she go to AA, and it was a pretty strong request, so she honored it. And I thought that, I'd help her, because I understood that she needed it. And so I'd take her to the meeting and drop her off, and I'd go over to the bar and wait, and then I'd come back and pick her up, and we'd both go to the bar, and she'd tell me who was there and what they said and how much they put in the basket. And anonymity wasn't real big on her list when she got here. I failed to mention, too, we hear a lot of talk about drugs and that kind of stuff. I failed to mention that when I met her, Sandy was a drug addict. She was a pillhead. She had like half a dozen doctors on the string with prescriptions at different drugstores and all that kind of stuff. And it started to be getting difficult for her to get pills. And I told her, you don't need any of that shit. I said, it's all in your head. I said, you just come with me and have a drink. And she's a respectable member of Alcoholics Anonymous today because she's an alcoholic. And I used to think I could drink until I met her. I wish I had taken it with me. I'd love to show it to a few people. But I've got a picture of Sandy at home that was taken on probably a month before we quit drinking. I had a party at about 7 o'clock in the morning. And she looks good. I mean, she looks real good. And that was like 40 hours and 2 or 3 quarts of Beefeater gin after she had started. She could drink. You know, and it's a bruise to a male ego to get married to somebody that can drink you under the table 2 or 3 times, you know, in the same drunk. You know, I'd pass out and wake up and keep going, and then pass out and wake up, and then she's just there. You know, and it was a stormy, violent type relationship, and we would always wind up in fights and busted doors and dishes and got thrown out of bars and got to the point where some bars we just walk in cold stone sober and they'd say out. And just out. You know, wouldn't even let us in the door. And I can wrap it all up with one story, and this is really, you know, insignificant compared to a lot of the things that happened to us, but we came home one night about 2-3 o'clock in the morning, and it was a real warm summer night. And we're walking from the garage to the house, and she says that she wasn't going in the house with anybody like me, and she was going to sleep on the lawn. Now, she made a decision to do that about 1.5 seconds before I decided to water the lawn. So she laid down, picked out the spot that she was going to sleep on, and she laid down there, and I went and got the hose out, and I turned around, and there she was laying on the very spot I intended to water. So I watered that spot, and she rolled on to the next spot that I was going to water, so I watered that spot. And she was rolling, and I was watering, and we had this little dialogue going on that you can fill in the words for yourself if you got any experience with an alcoholic marriage, you know. And it was really, really nothing, you know, and didn't pay no attention to it. As a matter of fact, we both laughed about it later. You know, it was just really insignificant. What makes it significant was about 2 years after I sobered up. I was up on a ladder washing the outside windows on the house one day. And we had a little toy poodle dog that was sleeping in the sun in the grass. And she looked so peaceful there, and I was going to take the hose and go, you know, give her a little shot with the hose and wake her up. And she looked so peaceful that I couldn't do it. It isn't that I wouldn't do it, because that's the kind of thing I do. But I couldn't do it. And then my knees started to shake and tears come to my eyes, and the thought struck me that all I needed to do was take one drink of alcohol. And it enabled me to treat the one person on this earth that means more to me than life itself in a way that I couldn't treat a dog. You know, and so this program and that thing made it, you know, it became very much more significant, that little episode. We went out that day on the 18th of June, 1976. And the next morning I woke up and Sandy wasn't nowhere to be found. And I asked the kids, you know, where's your mother? And he says, detox. Detox? You know, dragging my good name through the mud out there with him. She had been sitting, I went to bed. I got tired and went to bed, and she had been sitting up with her bottle of, remember I mentioned Beefeater gin, you know, I treated her right. Put her bottle of gin in one hand and her glass of gin in the other. And she was visited by somebody that I've come to know since I came to the program, and he tapped her on the shoulder. And he says, you just don't have to live like this anymore if you don't want to. And she poured that bottle out and went to detox. So maybe she heard something in those meetings while she was checking out what they were saying and laughing about what they were putting in the basket and all that other kind of stuff. Maybe the fact that she was drinking and going to AA meetings, and they knew she was drinking and going to AA meetings but allowed her to do so anyway, was okay. That maybe in her time and in God's time, she heard that voice that she had heard at that meeting. She got out of that detox center the next day, and she went down to a place where we go to meetings today, a club in town, and she sat there and talked with a guy that I had worked with and drank with, and he had joined AA about 5 years before that. She talked to him for a couple hours, and he told her, can you just not take a drink today? And then she came home, and she says, I found my kind of people. She says, Alcoholics Anonymous is going to be number one in my life from now on. She says, you might be able to be number two. That's a hell of a long way from King, let me tell you. And she left there, and she went back to that club. Got up the next morning, stayed there till midnight. Got up next morning, 8 o'clock, down that club. Stayed there till midnight, day after day. Every day I left the house, I thought, the hell with this. She can shove this, I don't want no part of this stuff. And I'd head for the bar, and I'd get there. Somehow I didn't order a drink. Same day as our wedding anniversary. And I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know that something was happening. I didn't have any knowledge of how this stuff worked. After a few days, I thought, maybe I'll go down and see what's so interesting at that damn club. I was lonely. I had been detached from. And by the way, Betty, if I have any kind of resentments remaining, in that time, I joined Al-Anon too. That previous 6 months, and I'd went for a while, and I'm not a member of Al-Anon today for one reason and one reason only. I didn't identify. I sat and listened to the non-alcoholic talking about their lives, and I didn't identify. And I'm in AA because I do identify. So I'm kind of an Al-Anon dropout, I guess. But I did come back with one kind of a resentment when I listened to Al-Anon's talk. And I know when Sandy sat down and talked to that friend of mine about us and her and whatever she talked about, I'm sure my name came up. And I'm sure she said Bob. Al-Anons don't talk that way. They talk about the alcoholic, like the piano. Or my alcoholic, like my German Shepherd. Hell, if you don't know our names, move. But other than that, I'm right with you. And I started going to meetings. And at our place, when you go to meetings, we introduce ourselves, closed meetings with Alcoholics Anonymous. And I went to first meeting I ever went to was an open meeting, speaker meeting. And the speaker was the guy that started AA in Superior. That had no significance to me that night at all. But it does now. 2 weeks from now, we'll be holding a roundup at Superior, celebrating 50 years of AA in Superior. And I'm kind of glad that I was at a meeting. My first meeting was the guy that started it there. And I got to know him quite well. I gave him a 42-year pin one year. Anyway, I started going to closed meetings. And at our place, when you go to closed meetings, you go around the table and introduce yourself. My name's Joe, I'm an alcoholic. My name's Pete, I'm an alcoholic. She'd say, my name's Sandy, I'm an alcoholic. I say, my name's Bob, and I'm Sandy's husband. And nobody threw me out. It wasn't nobody that come rushing up to me and say, do you have a desire to stop drinking? You have to identify yourself as an alcoholic. Or, nobody said nothing. Either they were too dumb to, which I suspect, or maybe they just knew something that I didn't know. Maybe they knew that I was sitting right where I belong. In any event, they allowed me to sit there from June until Thanksgiving Day. And on Thanksgiving Day, I sat at a meeting for the first time. And I'm going to lots of meetings, almost every day. And I sat at a meeting for the first time and said, my name's Bob, and I'm an alcoholic. And that started my process in this program. And I soon heard that if you want what this program has to offer, if you really want this thing, you have to get something called a sponsor. And they told me to look for somebody that had that intangible something I wanted, and I didn't know what that was. And I looked around and I didn't see anybody. And we wandered over to a thing called a Big Book meeting in Duluth. And I heard a guy talk there. And I went back and I heard him again. And I was sitting at a meeting in Superior. And that same wacko was there. And he was talking about that there isn't 2 or 3 or 10 or 50 ways to work the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's one way. There's no such thing as an individual program. There's the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, or there's whatever you decide to devise. He said there was only one way to work the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was described in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. And anything that we did other than that wasn't the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I thought he was a wacko. I thought he was a nut. And then that guy that Sandy had talked to on our first day stood up. He says that Alcoholics Anonymous isn't like that. He says Alcoholics Anonymous is about being comfortable. And if something bothers you, don't mess with it. He says it's like going into a giant smorgasbord and you take what you want and leave the rest. And if something bothers you, just leave it alone. And I thought, that guy's got it all together. He knows what he's talking about. Well, the guy that knew what he was talking about was drunk in a couple of years, and the other guy became my sponsor. And today I agree that there isn't 2 or 3 or 10 or 12 ways to work the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's one way. That one way is described in the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. When I first asked him to sponsor me, he sat me down with this book, and he opened it to the preface of the first edition. And it says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book, and he underlined that word precisely. He turned to the second chapter of Alcoholics, or the second chapter of that book, and it said, if you're an alcoholic who wants to get over it, you may already be asking, what do I have to do? And it goes on to say that it is the purpose of this book to answer such questions specifically. We shall tell you what we have done. And he underlined that word specifically. And he turned to the fourth chapter of that book. And it says, lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. Where and how to find that power? Well, that's exactly what this book is all about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. And he underlined that word exactly. Precisely, specifically, and exactly. He says we have a precise, specific, exact program for the recovery from the disease of alcoholism. Where in the hell you take what you want and leave the rest is beyond me. And we started going through that book, line by line, word by word, and line by line, and paragraph by paragraph, page by page, chapter by chapter, and step by step. He spoon-fed me the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now I know, and you know, and he knows that none of us work this program that way. That nobody is able to do it so good that we are absolutely precise and specific and exact. We all know that. That's why we get to do it over again. I didn't take that inventory right the first time, so I get a chance to do it over again. I forgot about that one instruction in the book when I worked that step, so I get to do it over again. I thought that my idea was better than the book's idea, so I damn well have to do it over again. And so we do it over again, and we do it over again, and we do it over again. And that's why they call it practicing these principles in all of our affairs. Practicing these principles. Because we have to do them over and over and over. And he asked me, he says, have you started to pray yet? And I says, pray? I said, I don't even believe in nothing. What am I going to pray to? He said, I don't care. Just start doing it. I said, what am I supposed to say? And he says, thank you, or please in the morning, and thank you at night, and add whatever you want to add. I said, I don't want to add nothing. He says, that'll do it. And so I did it day after day. Got down on my knees, said please, got up, nothing happened. I was embarrassed, felt like a jerk. Occurred to me a long time later, if I was really convinced I was alone, why was I embarrassed? Well, I was about 10 years sober when that finally landed, but he told me to keep doing it, and I kept doing it. I made one decision I take credit for. That when I decided to ask somebody to be my sponsor, I promised myself that anything and everything he ever asked me to do, I would do. And I've done that from that day to this day. And not one single time was he wrong. Not one single time was he wrong. And that makes him sound like a genius, don't it? And he's not. He's the same as the rest of us. He's got feet of clay. What it is the different types of problems. There's only two kinds of problems. Little problems that have easy solutions and big problems that have insurmountable solution. The difference between little problems and big problems are you have little problems and I have big problems. Yours are very easy for me to see a solution to. Mine are absolutely impossible. But they were easy for him to see a solution to. And so I kept praying. One day I come home, it was a terrifically bad day. Everything had went wrong, and I stormed into the house, and I always prayed in the bathroom. Now, Elkie's praying in the bathroom because it's the only house, or it's the only room inside the house generally with a lock on it. We don't want anybody to catch us praying. Like Claire Selden says, they didn't mind them coming home and finding her on, spread eagled on the lawn, but she didn't want anybody to catch her praying. But I stomped up the stairs and I slammed that door and I locked it and I got down on my knees and I said something and I jumped back up, and the greatest miracle that's ever happened to me in my life happened to me in that instant. My attitude changed. Just that. Just like that. Now, nothing had ever worked for me like that before. Booze had never worked that fast. Drugs had never worked that fast. Relationships had never worked that fast. Geographical changes had never worked that fast. Nothing had ever worked that fast for me. Just like that, my attitude changed. And I came out of that bathroom. And I asked Sandy, I says, would you do something with me before we go to bed at night? And she says, what's that? I says, would you get down on your knees and say a prayer with me? And she just laughed, and she says, sure. She says, I was wondering when the hell you're going to get out of that bathroom. And we started going through them steps, and I went on to make that decision. And I didn't know what that decision meant. Somebody talked about that earlier. I said, I didn't know, what the hell do they mean? Turn my will out, I thought they wanted me to go to Africa. And my sponsor informed me that they're having enough problems in Africa as it was without sending somebody like me over there, And so what I come to understand about that step was that what I needed to do was make a decision to do the very best I could with the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I dedicated myself to working this program to the very best of my ability. I made that decision in the third step and implemented it in the following steps. When I sat down and made that inventory, and I found out that it isn't really that difficult, not that complicated. When I sat down with my sponsor to talk about those things, and he told me, he said, I know there's a couple things that you'll never tell anybody that you're going to go to the grave with. It's the secrets that you feel are so terrible that you can't talk to them about anybody. He says, so we're going to talk about them first and get them out of the way. And that's what we did. And that's what I do with everybody I sponsor. He pushed me into the sixth and seventh step. We talked about the first five for a little while, and he says, all right, now we're going to get into 6 and 7. If you read it in the big book, it's 2 paragraphs. Sounds almost insignificant, but it's the meat of the program. It's where the action really happens. It's the glue that holds everything together. There's 5 steps before them too, and there's 5 steps after them too. And without benefit of them too, nothing happens except another drink. I kept hearing about, well, you, and I did it this way, really. I took my 5th step and started making amends, and then a little while later, we went back to make amends for the amends that I had made. Because I didn't know what I was doing. And I found out that something takes place in that 6th and the 7th step. It's called an attitude change. And that's what I need that in order to go on to the 8th and 9th steps. Without that attitude change, the 8th and 9th steps are dangerous, if not impossible. And there's a story I like about attitude changes, and it concerns a little girl, and about 4 foot tall, or 4'10", weighs about 90 pounds. And she married this guy about 6'5", and he weighs about 260. And they get up to the hotel room on their wedding night. And he takes his pants off and he throws them at her. And he says, you climb into them, woman. And she didn't know what the hell he was doing, but she figured I'll humor him and go along with him, see what he's talking about. So she took his pants and she pulls them up, and they fit her like a pup tent, and she says, "Honey, I can't fill your pants." He says, "You just remember that woman, we'll have a long and happy marriage." And she just kind of smiled at him, and she went over and she opened up her suitcase and she took out a pair of her little bikini panties. And she says, "Okay, mister, you get into them." So he figured, well, she went along with me, I'll go along with her. So he put one foot through, and then he put the other foot through, and it got him up to the ankles and a little bit higher than that. That was it. They weren't going no higher. He says, "Honey, I can't get into your panties." And she says, "No, hotshot, and you ain't about to till you change your attitude." And that attitude change takes a lot of prayer. Sam Shoemaker told us about prayer, told us about God. He says, try the God experiment. Forever after, you'll be able to argue about the experiment, but you'll never be able to deny the experience. And I can't deny the experience that prayer has meant in my life. And it led me to them amends steps. I thought the 8th step was just about making a list, and I still think that's important, but I found out that the real meat to that thing is about something else. It's about forgiveness. And those steps are about cleaning up relationships. And my most damaging relationship was with my father. And I didn't know how to clean that up. And I didn't know that I could forgive him. And again, with the help of the 6th and the 7th steps and that change of attitude that had occurred there, I was able to feel forgiveness for my father. And when I was able to feel forgiveness for my father, I was able to feel love going out from me to him. And when I was able to feel that, I was able to experience the love coming from him to me that had been heading my way since the day I was born. But I was never able to accept it because it wasn't on my terms. And when I was able to do that, to let that go out from me, we'll talk about that at the end of this meeting. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. If I want forgiveness, I have to forgive. If I want trust, I have to trust. If I want love, I have to love. These things have to emanate from me before they can come back to me. And that's what Francis was talking about. And I was able to do that, and we cleaned that up. And my father's now dead, but I was able to clean that relationship up before that happened. And it was a great feeling. And I was able to clean up a lot of my other relationships. A relationship is like a fine mahogany table. And when we damage somebody, it's like taking a nail and driving it into the middle of that table. And when we go up and say, I'm sorry, it's like pulling the nail out. But what do we do with the hole? What do we do with the hole? And that's what the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th steps are all about. You see, what it's about is living those amends. An amend is not an I'm sorry. Any of you people somebody did a survey on it, and they thought they found that somewhere between 2,327 and 9,642 times, they don't hear that I'm sorry anymore. And we spend a lifetime giving them I'm sorry, and pretty soon they just don't hear that. An amend is changing the behavior that caused the harm. So if I want to make an amends to somebody, I got to change the behavior that caused the harms and do anything they want me to do to make that right. And I've got to live that. In a 10th step is first 9 steps all wrapped up into one. In the first 9 steps, we're given a program for living. In the 10th step, they hand it to us and say, take it out on the city streets and try it for a while. But we've been working hard now. We've been working hard. Then there's a little line in there when it's talking about the 10th step. It says, it is easy to let up on a spiritual program of action and rest on our laurels. And then it says, we are in trouble if we do, for alcohol is a deadly foe. I pointed that out to my sponsor. I says, what does this mean? I says, what's a laurel? And he went and looked it up in a dictionary. And he came back and he said, it's a sprig of a fir tree. I says, well, what the hell does this mean then? He says, that means if you don't do everything this book asks you to do, precisely, specifically, and exactly the way it asks you to do it, you're going to wind up on your ass in the bushes. So that's what we tried to do, and I went on to try to improve that conscious contact with God as I understood Him, and prayer is talking and meditation is listening, the way I got it understood, and one of the things that I've discovered is that the best way I can meditate is at meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm not the kind of guy that can sit and listen to uninteresting people. And unfortunately, a whole lot of the people in AA aren't too interesting to listen to. So I just tune them out. And if I didn't like you, I wouldn't listen to you at all. And one night where somebody was talking and they says that God speaks to us through people. And I could remember hearing that and knowing, by God, He's right. I know that. I really agree with that. Then this guy that I didn't like talked next. I just tuned him out. And when he got all done talking, the thought struck me. I wonder if he's the guy that God decided to use as the instrument to talk to me tonight. And I didn't get the message. And since then I made a concentrated effort to try to listen to everybody that talks in Alcoholics Anonymous, especially the people that aren't too interesting to listen to, and especially the people that I don't like. And there's nobody in Alcoholics Anonymous that I don't love. But you gave me some freedom there, because you told me I have to love them. You told me if that phone rings at 3 o'clock in the morning, I got to love them enough to get up and go out there. But you gave me the freedom there. You says you don't have to like them, and so I can do that. And I think with most of us, it's the people I don't like are the people I don't know too well. And somehow or another, once I get to know somebody pretty well, all of a sudden they've gotten better, and I like them a lot better now. I don't know how that works, but it seems to do that. That 12-step talks about service. And I'd just like to put in a plug for the service structure, the general service structure. And if you've never been involved with it, I'd seriously, urge you to take a shot at it. It's been a major, major thing in my life. And I've had the privilege of serving in a number of jobs and meeting a whole lot of people and getting to go to a whole lot of places. Just because I didn't say no. And that's basically all you need to do to get involved with a service structure is sooner or later you're going to get asked, or you can volunteer. Just try to remove the word no from your vocabulary for at least, the extent that you can, and try a couple of those terms and some of those jobs. And I think you'll find an area of this program that you've never known before. I know I did. And it's been the single most important thing in my life, as if I had to pick out one thing, would be my involvement in the service structure. And I mentioned, those kids, and I'd had a terrible relationship with those kids, and they'd all hated me. And I watched that hatred go from hatred to tolerance, to respect, and finally to love. That didn't happen all at once. It took some time. We watched all 4 of those kids become alcoholics. 3 of them are in Alcoholics Anonymous, or at least they sobered up in Alcoholics Anonymous. They're not regular members, but 3 of them are sober. One of them still drinking. Perfect job for an alcoholic. She got a golf cart that's a portable bar that she drives around in his golf course in Phoenix, Arizona. And I remember when our oldest daughter presented us with our first grandchild, and then succumbed to the worst of her alcoholism. And she'd be out there wherever, and we'd never know where that grandbaby was. And we'd hear stories about her getting beat up by her boyfriend over in the bar, or getting involved with this, and the grandkid being left there and left there. Which, what do we have to do? We got to stop this. We got to help this. We got to, what do we do? And I'm really, really, really grateful that we were among a bunch of people in Alcoholics Anonymous. When we says, what can we do? They knew the answer. And he says, absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Except remain examples of the fact that this program works. If you go raging into that bar, screaming and hollering and hauling her out of there, what's the difference between her and you? And we didn't castigate her about her drinking. We didn't say anything to her about her drinking. And one day she called Sandy and she says, "Can you help me?" Sandy told her no. She said, "But I can take you to the people who can." She gave her to you. And she's been sober ever since. Now, that grandbaby might be heading this way too, I'm not sure. But that was 15 years ago that she came here. And, or she came into our lives, rather. And 2 weeks ago, she did something that we didn't approve of at all. And that's, she made us great-grandparents. And I'm too damn young to be a great-grand. I called my mother the other day on her 82nd birthday and let her know she was a great-great-grandparent. And she said she was too young. That program, or that chapter to the wives in the book, the chapter that Al-Anon is based on, literally saved our marriage. Neither one of us knew how to be married. And we'd went to psychiatrists and psychologists and couples groups and all this stuff. And every place we went, they said, if you want a marriage to work, you got to work at it. If you want a marriage to work, you got to work at it. We kept hearing that. We were working at it. We didn't know what to do. We came to Alcoholics Anonymous, and you told us to leave the damn thing alone. You opened that book and showed us in there where it says, if you each have a willingness to look at your own defects, there will be little need to criticize each other. And so she took a look at her, and I took a look at me, and we just left that marriage alone, and it's been working fine ever since. I think it's necessary that we both continue to work this program, but so far we found it the best kind of life we've known. I've learned how to live in this program. I've learned how to be a man. I've learned how to be a son, a brother, a father, a husband, grandfather, great-grandfather. I found out there's some important words to a marriage. And everybody thinks about "I love you." And I think more important than that is "thank you." I've told Sandy, that she doesn't have to do anything for me. If she wants to cook, she can cook. If she don't want to cook, you don't have to cook. A lot of times she chooses not to cook, Sometimes we eat home, sometimes we eat, most of the time we eat out. Pretty obvious. If you look at us, we eat somewhere, But she knows that she doesn't have to cook. She knows she doesn't have to clean clothes. She knows she don't have to iron shirts. She knows she don't have to do any of that stuff. I don't care. I really, really don't care whether she does it or not. I ain't going to do it. If she don't do it, I'll get somebody else to do it. But I'm not going to do it. But something, when she knows that she doesn't have to do that stuff, and it's okay, and she does it anyway, it's real easy to be grateful for it. And if you're grateful for something, it's real easy to say thank you. So if I come home and she cooked a meal, I say thank you. If she's ironed a shirt, I say thank you. If she's cleaned the house up, I say thank you. Every once in a while she do something else, I say thank you. But I think I've talked too long. I generally do. And my wife's been looking at her watch for quite a bit now. I'd just like to tell you that your banner's wrong. Sign's wrong. Because long ago when I was involved with that third step of this program, I asked my sponsor, I said, I don't know what God's will is for me. He said, oh, well, that's easy. And he opened that book to page 133, and he says, read that line. And I read that line, and what that line says, we are sure God wants us to be happy, joyous, and free. He said, there it is. And he says, that ain't right. And I said, what do you mean it ain't right? He says, read it again. And I says, we are sure that God wants us to be happy, joyous, and free. He says, that ain't right. Read it again. I did that 5 times. Pretty soon I'm getting a little angry. And I says, we are sure that God wants us to be happy, joyous, and free, period. And he says, that's it. And I says, that's what? And he says, period. He says, does it say anything in there about momentary excursions into depression, anxiety, jealousy, remorse, anger, resentment? I says, no. He said, well, apparently those things are your will for you. Because God wants you to be happy, joyous, and free. So anytime any of that's happening in your life, He says, you'll know whose will's going on. You know, I talked at another place that had that same theme, and I told them it was wrong. And the next day I came back to the conference, and they had a big, about that big period there. And I tried to find somebody after the conference to find out if I could get that from them, and I couldn't find nobody that could tell me it was okay, so I just stole it. You know, and about 2 weeks later, I gave it to my sponsor for his birthday present. Hey. I'd like to close with a little story about that has a great deal of meaning to me. It's about how I took the first step in a program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because I happen to know the exact moment that I took the first step in a program of Alcoholics Anonymous. There was another guy in my group when I first sobered up. His name was Mickey. Mickey was a good friend of mine. We had done a lot of drinking together. And he'd gotten AA a little bit before I did, quite a bit before I did. But Mickey was never able to stay sober. He'd get 3 months sobriety, and then he'd go out and get drunk. And he'd get 6 months sobriety and go out and get drunk. He'd get 7 months sobriety, and he'd go out and get drunk. Never managed to get a year's sobriety. I never seen anybody that wanted this program more than Mickey. So, you know, desire in and of itself is not enough. But I kept rooting for Mickey when I'd see him go out there. And I think, Mickey can make it out there. Maybe I can make it out there. Oh, maybe I can make it out there. One day, Mickey made it to a lonely beach with a gun. And the next day, his wife called me and asked me to be a pallbearer at his funeral. And the 3 days leading up to Mickey's funeral, I didn't think a lot about Mickey. I thought a lot about me, and I thought a lot about you, and I thought a lot about this program. You know, there was a thing in there that and it talks about in the 3rd chapter about we had to concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. You know, I thought when I sat at that meeting on Thanksgiving Day of 1976 and said, my name's Bob and I'm an alcoholic, that I had taken that first step. But I hadn't conceded to my innermost self that I was really an alcoholic. And on the day of Mickey's funeral, when I walked in and my hand reached down and my fingers touched the handle of Mickey's casket, I knew in that instant that I was an alcoholic and would always be an alcoholic. I knew in that instant that the game was over, that never again could I go out there and try it, and if it didn't work, come back, because I didn't know if I could come back. From that instant to this instant, I have not had a serious thought about taking a drink. I had 100% wholly conceded to my innermost self that I was an alcoholic, and I had completely given myself to this very simple program. Father Martin has a thing that he talks about that no alcoholic dies drunk without buying the sobriety of another alcoholic. I choose to believe that Mickey bought mine. I choose to believe that because it puts a meaning in his death and a purpose in my life. And this afternoon, I'm just a substitute for Mickey. Thank you.